Okay, so lovely to be here today to talk about a subject that I think is extremely dear to all three of us, and maybe a few of you in the audience too. Or maybe you want to combat our love letter to Mumbai. Um, so I wanted to actually, when I was asked to moderate this session, I started thinking about the role of the city in my own work. And for me, I think Mumbai made me a writer. Very simply because when I was a little girl, and I always tell other children, tell children this, when I was little, one day when I was, I think about 8 or 9, I marched up to my mother when she was in the kitchen, looking very pained with life. And I said, I want to go to England. And my mother gave me this very blank look because we were the kind of family who had to think about 20 times before we went to Lonavala. And she said, England? Why? And I said, because the wishing chair is in England. Mr. Pink Whistle is in England. Magic faraway tree is in England. All adventure and magic is far away. And I have to go there. And I think when I grew up and became an adult, I realized a couple of things. I realized that it's not true. There's magic and adventure everywhere in a musty building stairwell, on a dusty road filled with doggy poo, in a quiet village. And that was something I really wanted to communicate to children. And I think that's why very deliberately I started writing my own books of adventure and magic and mystery set in my own city. And because that's what made me a writer, when I read Fiona and Tejaswini's books, I felt a great and deep sense of connection. Tejaswini's book is an extraordinary sort of exploration of the early 1900s, of Mumbai in the early 1900s. The story of a young boy who comes to the city, becomes a sort of a textile trader in the Mulji Jetha market, and then the trajectory of his life from there. And it's filled with the most intricate details. I really felt I had walked into a miniature painting when I read the book. Fiona's book is a marvelous romp across the city. It is an A to Z of Bombay, Mumbai. We beg to differ sometimes on what to call our city. But so it's got all kinds of details. It tells us about the dock explosion that resulted in gold bars raining down in the city and killing a whole bunch of people also. But the gold bars are more memorable. The story of the bird because of whom Hornbill House was named Hornbill House. The story of the banyan tree beneath which the Bombay Stock Exchange was born. And so I really wanted to ask Tejaswini and then Fiona, what is it? Was there a Bombay moment? Was there something of the city that triggered these two books? What role did the city play in your creation?
Bombay was very much a big inspiration behind my novel of historical fiction. I felt that as I was delving into the history of the first half of the 20th century, it seemed to me to be almost like an origin story of the city that we know today. It was a time when the textile industry was booming. It was a time when the silent film industry began, which was the birth of the Hindi film industry. And both these industries, textiles and films, have been a commercial backbone of the city.
Correct.
So it was fascinating to go back into those early years and see what the pioneers of those industries would have done. In what sort of context were those fortunes made? There were fortunes made in the mighty textile mills of the time, which have dwindled now, but which still live on because the mills have turned into malls. So we are still very much on that continuum of the story that began in the early 20th century.
Absolutely. And Fiona, of course, your city is everywhere in the book. It's entirely there. But what about Bombay forced you to write? How did you begin?
So for me, I think the biggest challenge was to move from the journalist mode to the storyteller mode. And in that process, I was also able to understand that, especially with younger people, that awareness is not there, let alone dialogue or a platform to understand the need for heritage. And when I say heritage, it's not just necessarily an old building. It's living, breathing heritage as well. So whether it's the Irani cafes whether it's that banyan tree that you mentioned. It's everywhere. And if the younger generation, 13, 14-year-olds, are too busy buried in their tablets and their laptops and their phones, it's going to vanish very soon. So I kept getting reminded of that. And in fact, a big factor was when I would attend sessions on heritage and history, the average age group was always 30 plus. And that for me was a huge disturbing fact, and it never changed, right? So I think somewhere I kept getting prodded about, I'd say about 10 years ago was when I said, something has to be done about this. And then I finally zeroed in on the format, using the letters of the alphabet. I zeroed in on that sometime during the lockdown. Yes.
Lovely. So both of you have lived in many cities. You've lived in Calcutta, you've lived in Bangalore, you've lived in 15 cities, which to me is a terrifying number. And we were just talking backstage, and Tejaswini said, well, I've become very good at packing. And my heart went out to her, because I live in the same building that I grew up in. So I've moved 3 floors in my life. So why Mumbai? Why Mumbai? Why is that so much the star of both your books?
I think once you've been born and brought up in Bombay, it doesn't really leave you. It sort of forms a kind of mindset which you never get away from. When I moved away from Bombay, I discovered it, to use your phrase, what you just told me. When I moved out of Bombay, I really discovered it in a very different way. And I realized that, over the years, I realized that people in Bombay are never content. Everyone wants more. I think that's a sort of mindset created by the city, and of course the people also create the city in a cycle. And wanting more has very little in Bombay, it has very little to do with how much you already have. So everybody's on this path to trying to get more, and it's a city that invites ambition, it invites risk-taking, and it often rewards ambition and risk-taking. So I thought this was a great sort of leaping off point for my novel. Secondly, why Bombay? The story is loosely based on the life of my great-grandfather, who arrived as a migrant in Bombay. He started living in a chawl in the early half of the 20th century, sharing a room with 2 other men. It was a time when the textile industry was booming, and he became a selling agent of textiles for Kohinoor Mills and made his fortune. Moving from the chawl to an apartment block, and finally ending up in a luxurious sea-facing mansion. And along the way, he also became a silent film producer. So he also rode that wave of the birth of the film industry, and ended up producing about 100 feature films, all silent films, and was the financier of Dada Saheb Phalke, who later became known as the father of Indian cinema. So my protagonist is loosely based on him, and also goes through this trajectory of the textile industry and becomes a producer in the silent film industry. And me being a great movie buff, I had a great time researching the silent film industry and setting my novel in that context.
And Fiona, why Mumbai?
I couldn't think of starting from any other city. I think it grows on you, just like what Tejaswini said. It grows on you, and then before you realize you're in love with it, it becomes your muse, irrespective of the crowds, the traffic jams, and everything that people might tend to find fault with the city. I really didn't care. It was something that I had to do for the city. And again, when I said earlier about it being for young people, that didn't necessarily mean that you don't look at the older generation who may have just bypassed it in that whole rush of, getting to work, getting home, because commuting in Bombay is, it's a deadly beast, as both of you would agree with me. So why not write it in a format, in a language which is not overwhelming? Because when I started planning anything to do with heritage, so I've written heritage books on heritage in the city for grown-ups earlier. And it scared the hell out of me. It really scared the hell out of me when I started doing research, because I'm not a historian, I'm not a conservation architect. I'm a journalist who happened to do my journalism in Bangalore, so the city is it's very close to my heart. So yes, I was very clear that this book, when I do get the freedom, and this I have to credit my publisher and my agent, when I get the freedom to do a book like this, it's going to be something that is inviting, that's welcoming, it's fun, it's quirky, and at the same time it tells you that, hey guys, guess what? This little cove over here actually has a little bit of history. This little chalk over there has a little bit of history. So I think that was the crux of it, to not miss those little corners and contours of the city that'll have a little bit of a history to tell you. And in a storybook format, I was very clear that the storybook format had to be integral to the soul of the book.
No, I totally agree, because I have 3 daughters, and once when they were growing up, I had a bunch of kids over post summer holidays for a play date, and they were all talking, and I was eavesdropping, and one of them was saying, "When I grow up, I will live in Vancouver. When I grow up, I will live in Melbourne." And I was thinking, why? Look around you at the wonders around you, and I think that, in a way, pushed me to write a book which then turned out to be a clue hunt around Bombay. I just wanted these children to look up and see the little amazing things around them. So I fully get what you feel. So Fiona, my next question is for you. How much did being a journalist sort of help with your writing?
So I think the first obvious thing was observation. Being a journalist for 2 decades, I think observation is something that by default is what you always notice. I was very clear. I said, I am going to ensure that things, words, everything that you hear, traveling on the local train, I'm sure many of you in the audience here would have traveled on the local train. It's a great place to collect information. Yeah. You'll agree on that, both of you. So I used to enjoy those moments when I would manage to enter the train and then get a seat. I think those 2 things, and you thought your day was sorted, the rest of your day is going to go well. So yeah, I think a journalist, being a journalist, the observation part was one thing. The second is the people, because as with every city, it's the people that make it. It's the communities, and the city has been blessed with all kinds of migrations over the years, from the 10th, 11th century, and even before that, from the hinterland as well as from the sea. So we've been really lucky, because Bombay is this natural harbor, and you had enemies, you had friends, all kinds of people who used the harbor to come here, and it was a very hospitable space. So all of that assimilated into my thought process when it came to the book. I was also very clear to ensure that people are in the book. So yes, so you will have this very famous, God bless his soul, late Baman Kohinoor, who is the owner of the famous Britannia restaurant. You'll have someone like him in the book. And then you'll have someone like Dr. Salim Ali. So they're all heritage. They're all very important to us. And over the years of my time with journalism, I realized that it's very important to have a face to the discoverability. I think that made it very clear in my work.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I paint my family witless, because wherever we go in the city, I will say, oh, that's the building where the corrupt vice chancellor lived. Or that's the building where that registrar who murdered his wife lived. And finally, one day my daughters turned to me and said, how many bad people do you know? It was very sad. So now I try to give them a sort of a pearly, glossy version and say, that's the place where the do-gooder lived. But I think the murderers are more interesting sometimes. But Tejaswini, how much has distance helped you write the book? Did you not feel the need to be sitting in Mumbai and writing such an immediate book? How did you manage to write it from such a distant and different land?
I've noticed that when I'm not in India, it really helps me to write about India and about Bombay, that the distance does help. I think Bombay is such an overwhelming city that you sort of get pulled into it, you get sucked into the commutes, the daily life, everything going on around you. And not being there just helped me to get a perspective, a little bit like zooming out on a, in a photo or in a film, the way you zoom out and then you can see the canvas more clearly, the big epic canvas that you're going to paint on, because it is an epic storyline. My story starts in 1899 and ends in 1952. So 5 decades. And so I needed that distance. And of course, it was not about contemporary Bombay anyway. So it wouldn't have particularly helped being in Bombay and writing about several decades ago. So I started the book when I was living in Azerbaijan. And I wrote the bulk of it when I was living in Fiji for 2 years. And finished it back in Azerbaijan again. And Fiji was the perfect, idyllic spot to write it. Everything you've seen about Fiji, all the photos you've seen, they're all true. It really is that beautiful. I was amazed to see. So I had the most lovely little study with a view outside, perfect for writing. So that, yeah, the distance certainly helped. Sometimes it was a bit constraining because I wanted to a little bit of extra research, and then of course I couldn't get access. So that was the only constraint. But creatively, it was an advantage to not be in Bombay.
So this brings me to my next question very automatically. How did both of you do this research? And this I really want to know. How did you time travel and get such tiny details? You can feel it. You can smell the city of 1911 or 1920 or 1951. How?
I did a lot of research in the British Library and the SOAS Library in London for the textile industry history and the business context of the time. And for the silent film industry, I spent quite a bit of time in the National Film Archive in Pune. They have a fabulous library there. But what really gave depth and complexity and authenticity to my research was the hours of interviews I did with older family members. Hours of tape recordings, which I then transcribed and picked out the bits that were relevant for my novel. And interestingly, it was the women who had the most interesting stories. I think it's the way women communicate with each other and also across generations. So I would hear from the women things that my great-grandmother had said and which had come down the generations, yeah. And that really gave that insight into things which simply wouldn't come out with library research.
How did you do your research?
So for me, it was a nice little joyride because I would end up collecting lots of information for some of the stories that I would work on, especially on conservation projects, restored buildings in the city. And then you'll have this little quirky part which, unfortunately wouldn't make it to my story in the newspaper. So that was a nice little nudge, a prod, where you said, yeah, okay, I'm going to keep this for something really interesting. And I'm glad that I did that little bit of an exercise. I think all of you should also do that. If you come across interesting facts, trivia, if you're one of those nuts, heritage nuts, trivia nerds, you should keep it aside. You never know when it's going to come handy. So that was a big help for me. And I think the second thing is the people of the city. I come back to that again. They were doing so many interesting things to save heritage in Bombay. They were doing it throughout. So one of them, in fact, and I'll keep this really short because it's a longish process that they finally, where they won a battle. The Oval Maidan residents, very empowered bunch of senior citizens, all retired, but they can fight tooth and nail to ensure that their buildings are in good condition. I followed that for about 7 years, and the end result was that it won a UNESCO World Heritage tag. So they have actually managed to protect their buildings by ensuring their voices are heard. So it's great stories like those which make me feel very inspired and I think responsible to sort of put their stories out there and make the coming generations that much more invested in their city's local heritage.
Yeah. And research, I think, sometimes throws up such unexpected details. Like when I was researching for my new book, Zen, I encountered this very remarkable woman who lived in 1935, and her name was Ruth Hass. And I encountered a small news report that said, Miss Ruth Hass got bitten by a python while she was dancing with it for a little film. And I got like really sorry for her, and I felt very bad, and I wondered what had happened to her. 3 days later, there's a new news report. Today, she will be dancing with a leopard on the stage. And you wonder at these women who, you know, the guts and glory and the kind of entertainment that was there in the city of 100 years ago. It really, you know, transports you into a new world.